Back here on Community Access Television, I'm James Lowe, and Ron Thornburg's with us. Secretary, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for letting me join you again.
What are you doing here in Salina this evening?
Well, I was invited. You know, I don't get to go many places unless I'm invited. So
Now, you're speaking tonight here for the League of Women Voters, correct?
right. This is the annual membership meeting of the Saline County League of Women Voters, and they wanted me to come in and do an update on where we stand on voting in the state of Kansas. There have been a lot of changes in the last, I'm going to say decade, and really in the last half of that decade, we've made enormous changes in the state of Kansas, and tonight's going to be an update, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent travels I've had out of the country that have really created a comparison with our system versus other systems around the world.
Well, what exactly does your job entail for the people that aren't really familiar with what you do?
I tell you, that's a great thing about being Secretary of State. Nobody knows what I really do. So I can be an expert on anything, and they kind of have to think I might be telling the truth. No, in the Secretary of State's office, we have hundreds of statutory duties, but really, let me break them down into three areas. Number one, we're the chief election official for the state of Kansas. We work with county election officers, county clerks like Don Merriman here in Saline County. In addition to that, we also work with the business community. Anytime a business needs authorization to transact business in the state of Kansas to become a corporation, we grant that authorization. And lastly, Uniform Commercial Code. It's part of the banking industry. Basically, anytime a business obtains a loan, the bank files documentation with the Secretary of State's office to make sure that collateral is not used in multiple counties. So there's a lot of that record keeping within the business community.
So what do you see coming up for the state of Kansas as far as you're concerned?
Oh, I think my biggest concern is just like that we've seen with unfortunately too many other states in our nation, and that is the economy. We are losing thousands of jobs in the state of Kansas, and that is really starting to have a ripple effect. We're starting to see some good signs in the economy right now. For instance, new housing starts here in Salina. New housing starts are a little bit better than they were last year. Nothing really to brag about, but they're a little bit better. And we're seeing some of that take place, and I'm seeing some indicators that banks are starting to lend a little bit more now than they were before. That's going to free up some capital and help us out. But at the end of the day, going into the next fiscal year in the state of Kansas, we expect to be about $500 million upside down, $500 million short, and it's going to take significant cuts to be able to work that out. And if this last legislative session was difficult, the next one's going to be an enormous challenge.
Well, doing some preparation for this interview, I noticed there's a link on your website for KansasCharityCheck.org. Give us a little rundown of what this website is.
You know, Charity Check is really one of those great, unfortunately, unknown elements in the state of Kansas. That's one of those statutory duties I was telling you about. Kansas Charity Check just very, very simply means that anytime a charity is doing business in the state of Kansas, they must register with the Secretary of State's office. Anytime anyone is soliciting on behalf of that charity, they must register with the Secretary of State's office. And it's basically a preventive measure to make sure that the scam artists don't roll into town and say, boy, if I got a deal for you and I'm raising money for X, and then it turns out that X is their pocket instead of an actual charity. And so through that registration, if someone approaches you to make a contribution to a charity, just simply ask them for their Secretary of State registration number, or go to the Secretary of State's website and you can capture that information. I actually had one time an individual called me at home soliciting for a charity, and so I asked them for this number, and he said, yes, we've been endorsed by the Kansas Secretary of State.
That's nice.
I said, really? I don't remember doing that.
Well, a side story to that, I had a little boy the other night come to my door and try to collect for a local newspaper to do subscriptions, and I said, I already had a subscription. I wouldn't be, need to re-up or anything. And he goes, well, could you just give me some money anyway? And I'm like, why? And he goes, a donation? And I'm like, a donation to the paper? And he's like, no, just a donation to me. So, you know, that whole thing of them calling you at home. And
You have to admire his guts, if nothing else. So.
Now, how many pieces of ID when you go to register to vote or when you go vote does the state of Kansas require you to have?
Actually, right now, when you register to vote, it is not required to take identification with you. And I have encouraged the Kansas legislature for the last 5 years to adopt a identification at the polling place. I just simply want to know that you are who you say you are and you live where you say you live. The legislature has not made that law. Now, let me backtrack on that a little bit. Federal law requires that all first-time voters, so if you're a newly registered voter in the county, then you must show identification prior to receiving your ballot. So first-time voters must show identification. After that first time, you're not required to show identification at all.
Wow, that's interesting.
That's kind of my response as well. I think it's something we ought to do, and Governor Sebelius and I disagreed. She vetoed. I got it through the legislature a number of times. She has a 100% record of vetoing that on me, and so we just basically we agreed to disagree. Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of states that they require like 18 pieces of ID to either register or to vote. How can some of these places, like the polling places, how are they supposed to keep track of all this?
Well, no, actually, they don't require all 18. You can bring any one of those 18. And so, and we provide a list to the polling place workers saying, here are the acceptable forms of identification. So we give them that list of 16, 18, whatever it is, and then they can check off from that list. And basically, the consistency is that it tells us who you are and where you live, and that it's everything from a bank statement to a utility bill, to your driver's license, to a non-driver's license. For a university student, their university identification card. So we'd really tried to capture anything and everything, just identification that someone would have. And more often than not, that they would carry on their person, that they could use to show identification for those first-time voters.
Now, what's your opinion on the forms of ID to vote? What should the acceptable forms be?
I think those acceptable forms ought to be a document that has some basis in a systematic approval. And by that I mean there's been a formal process that at some point along the line someone has verified that you are who you say you are and you live where you say you live. I'm willing to trust those third parties to do their part. A utility company wants to know that you are who you say you are and you live where you say you live. A bank is required to do the very same thing. We can do the same thing with the driver's license. As a matter of fact, we're working very aggressively with the Division of Motor Vehicles of the Department of Revenue to accomplish that very same thing.
Well, that's cool. Well, I appreciate you doing this. Thanks for swinging by, and enjoy the talk this evening. It looks like the people are starting to fill up in here. I overheard earlier they offered someone coffee, and I think it might have been you or the gentleman that was with you. Why do you guys want the audience to be caffeinated up before you get this thing going?
Oh, if you've ever heard me speak, you want all the caffeine in the audience you can possibly have.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for doing this. And before I go, I'm going to step out of the picture, and I'd like you to just basically look at the camera, say your name and your title, and say you're watching Access TV. Just cut us a little late.
This is Kansas Secretary of State Ron Thronburgh. You're watching Access TV.
Thank you much, my friend. I appreciate it. And if
Thanks
you'd like
for
a
making
copy,
time to